Good morning, everyone. And happy fall. It's the first day of fall today, I guess. It's the equinox as of a few hours ago. And with all the sort of lack of rain that we've been having, it seems like the trees are already starting to change a little bit. Some have kind of given up early and they'll patiently endure the winter until next spring. So my topic today is patience. This is the third of the 6 paramitas, or perfections. And this full list, as we probably know, includes generosity, ethical conduct. The third one is patience. Then energy or zeal, meditation, and wisdom. So these are 6 of the things that we try to work on as Buddhist practitioners. However, my objective today is to make sure that everyone here aspires to become a ninja. And I will explain what that means later. Maybe the people that speak Japanese can figure it out. So to start with, though, I'll read a story from the Jataka Tales. So these are a collection of stories about the Buddha's past lives. And often these are pretty fun stories. It seems that a lot of these were kind of developed as a way to speak about Buddhist principles to lay people in an entertaining way. And so this one is called Kshanti Vadan. So Kshanti is the Sanskrit word for patience, and Vadan means like a teacher or a teaching. And it's kind of interesting. These stories, at least in this collection, it's a Mahayana collection. It has sort of notes at the beginning and end of the text that sort of explains who the intended audience might be or when to talk about it. So this one says, "Truly to those who have wholly imbibed the virtue of forbearance and are great in keeping their tranquility, there is nothing unbearable. This will be taught as follows." So in this case, if you want to talk about forbearance, this is a good one to talk about. So I'll just mention quickly, I'll come back to it, but a lot of synonyms are used for patience. We have, it seems in English, a lot of words for this. So forbearance, patience, endurance, tolerance are all words that get used to translate this word, Kshanti. So I'll do sort of a mixture of like reading this story and also just summarizing parts of it because it's a little bit long. So, one time, the Bodhisattva, it is said, was an ascetic who had forsaken the world. He had become convinced that the life in a home, since it is beset with bad occupations, leaves but little room for righteousness. For it is visited by many sins and evils, and unfit for quiet, inasmuch as it implies the prevalence of material interest and sensual pleasures. It is exposed to the inroad of defiling passions, love, hatred, infatuation, jealousy, anger, lasciviousness, pride, selfishness, and the rest. It involves the loss of the possession of shame and is the abode of covetedness and wicked lust. So, as we know in the early tradition, being a sort of true home leaver, renouncing your family life and living in a monastic community was praised above all else, kind of. On the other hand, he understood the homeless state, as it avoids material property and sensual objects, to be an agreeable one, being wholly free from those evils. Thus knowing, he became an ascetic, eminent by his conduct, his learning, his placidity of mind, his modesty, and his self-restraint. He was in the habit of always preaching forbearance and teaching the Dharma from that point of view, in strict conformity with the vow that he had taken to do so. People neglecting his proper name and that of his family made him a name of their own invention, calling him Kshanti Vadan. So that's the preacher of forbearance. So in this story, I'm going to skip a big part here. He lives in a hermitage in the forest. And one day, the king comes along with his harem of wives, because that was a thing back in India. And he is enjoying himself, drinking alcohol, while all his wives sort of frolic about, playing with flowers and stuff. And eventually he sort of, falls asleep on his couch or whatever as he's watching this. And the royal wives, decide to sort of wander off on their own, and eventually they end up at this hermitage where the forbearance teacher is sitting in meditation. And the text describes their impression of him as follows. So the royal wives, as if they were attracted by the splendor of that hermitage, the loveliness of which was enhanced by the supernatural power of its occupant, entered the hermitage and saw the eminent Muni sitting there with crossed legs under a tree, a view auspicious and purifying to behold. So Muni is sage, as in Shakyamuni. His tranquility gave a soft expression to his countenance. The exceeding profundity of his mind inspired awe. His face radiated, as it were, from the splendor of his penance, and owing to his diligent exercise of dhyana, that is meditation, bore the beautiful expression of calm, as it's proper to as is proper to undisturbed senses, even though the loftiest subjects of meditation were present to his thoughts. In short, he was like the embodied Dharma. The luster of his penance subdued the minds of those royal wives, and the very sight of him was sufficient to make them abandon their dalliance, frivolity, and haughtiness. This was translated in 1895, so you can kind of tell. Accordingly, they went to him in a humble attitude and sat down respectfully in a circle around him. So I like this idea that he's just so kind of thoroughly purified that they immediately want to sort of learn from him. It sort of reminds me of the story about our ancestor in this lineage, Sawaki Roshi, when he was kind of early in his journey to become a priest. He ran away from home and went to Eiheiji, but they wouldn't take him. So he sat there, like sort of waiting for them to take him in, not eating or drinking. And eventually, I think some of the sort of people were like, we got to do something with this guy. So they took him into kind of like a workshop, I think, near Eiheiji. And one day, even though he wasn't really practicing, properly speaking at that point, he decided to sit down and do zazen. And this woman who, would cook and clean and stuff, and had normally kind of ordered him around in a somewhat rude way, I guess, saw him sitting zazen and did prostrations to him. She was so sort of struck by how kind of magnificent he looked in this posture. So it's kind of a similar feeling here, this magnificence of his practice. Okay, so the wives are sitting around. He starts, teaching the Dharma to them. He says a lot of things. I'll just select a few of the sort of highlights. So he says, blossoms are the ornaments of trees. It is flashes of lightning that adore the big rain clouds. The lakes are adorned by lotuses and water lilies with their drunken bees. But virtues brought to perfection are the proper ornament of living beings. Forbearance is the ornament of the powerful. It is the highest pitch of the strength of ascetics. And since it has the effect of a shower of rain on the conflagration of evils, it may be called the extinguisher of misfortune, both in this world and after death. To the virtuous, forbearance is a coat of mail, blunting the arrows which the tongue of the wicked shoots off against them. Mostly it changes those weapons into flowers of praise, which may be inserted in the garland of their glory. I quite like that image, So sort of sitting in patience as you're maybe being kind of subjected to something that you don't want to be subjected to, but everything that's coming at you just transforms into a flower that you can kind of add to your own flower garland. Forbearance is stated to be the killer of delusion, that adversary of the Dharma, and an easy contrivance by which to reach salvation. Who then ought not to do his utmost to obtain forbearance, that virtue invariably conducive to happiness? He goes on, says a few more things, but in the story at this point, the king wakes up. He's still a little drunk, but also now wondering where all his wives went. So he's able to, in the story, it's said that all these wives are sort of skipping around throwing flowers. So he's able to sort of follow the trail of flowers, and he finds them sitting around Kshantivadan, and he's not happy. So he becomes enraged finding them there. And in this version of the text, it says they've long been enemies, the king and this person, and it's not really explained. But apparently in the Pali version, the king is supposed to be a previous life of Devadatta, who's like sort of one of the main villains in the Buddhist story. He's the person who is supposed to have tried to kill the Buddha, and then later, when he failed at this several times, split the Sangha in two. So the text then describes the anger of the king as he faces his wives and this Buddha, or Buddha-to-be. So his color altered, drops of sweat appeared on his face, his limbs trembled, his brows frowned, and his eyes, tinged reddish, squinted, rolled, stared. The loveliness, grace, and beauty of his figure had waned. He pressed his hands together and rubbing them, squeezing thereby his finger rings and shaking his golden armlets, scolded that excellent rishi, uttering many invectives. "Ha!" he exclaimed. "Who is that knave who injures our majesty, casting his eyes on our wives? Under the disguise of a muni, this hypocrite acts like a fowler." So rishi is like a sort of, learned practitioner, or sort of someone who's advanced in practice. Muni, again, is sage. And a fowler, if you're not familiar with that term, is someone who catches birds. So I guess the wives are like birds, maybe. Those words alarmed and disturbed the eunuchs, so he has sort of a team of court eunuchs, I guess, who said to the king, "Your Majesty ought not to speak so. This is a muni who has purified himself by a long life of vows and restraints and penance. Kshantivadan, Kshantivadan is his name." Nevertheless, the king, in the pervertedness of his mind, did not take to heart their words and continued, "Alas, ah! So it is then that a long time already since this hypocrite, setting himself up as the foremost of holy ascetics, has deceived people by his forgery. Well then, I will lay open the true nature of that hypocrite, though he keeps it veiled with his ascetic's dress and well conceals it by practicing the art of delusion and false godliness." After thus speaking, he took his sword from the hand of the female guard who was bearing it and rushed on the holy rishi with the determination of striking him as if he were his rival. So very angry indeed. It looks like he's going to potentially start hurting Kshantivadan. So at this point in the story, the wives at first sort of try to calm him down. They sort of put themselves between the king and Kshantivadan to try to help him. But this just makes him angrier. They say a few things and eventually sort of back down at the advice of the eunuchs. The eunuchs are kind of like, "You might want to get out of the way. He seems pretty mad." And then the story continues. Scornfully, the king said to that foremost of rishis, "Let us now see your attachment to forbearance." And so speaking, he directed his sharp sword to the right hand of the muni, which was a little extended towards him, with a prohibitive gesture, having its very fine and long fingers upward, and severed it from his arm like a lotus from its stalk. So he cuts off the Kshantivadan's hand. I should also say I left out that before this happened, Kshantivadan sort of tries to also talk him down and basically says that, if you do this, it's going to look really bad for you. And he's like, "I'm not really concerned about myself, but you're going to have a hard time if you kill me." But obviously that doesn't work. So. Yet the bodhisattva did not feel so much pain even after his hand had been cut off, so steadfast was he in keeping his vow of forbearance. As sorrow concerning the cutter, whose future misfortune he saw, which was to fall terrible and irremediably upon that person hitherto accustomed to pleasures. And thinking within himself, "Alas, he has transgressed the boundary of his good. He has ceased to be a person worth admonishing," and commiserating him, as he would do a sick man given up by the doctors, he kept silent. But the king continued to speak threatening words to him. "And in this manner your body shall be cut to pieces until death. Desist from your hypocritical penance and leave that villainous forgery." So he's still sort of trying to claim that he's just faking, even though he's already cut off his hand, and he's still being very calm. So the bodhisattva made no answer. He understood him to be deaf to admonition and had learnt his obstinacy. Then the king successively and in the same way cut off the other hand of the high-minded one, both his arms, his ears and nose, and his feet. So often these stories are a little intense in this way. Yet that foremost of munis did not feel sorrow or anger when the sharp sword fell down on his body. His knowledge that the machinery of his body must eventually come to an end, and his habitual practice of forbearance against everybody made him so strong. In consequence of its habitual friendliness, the mind of that virtuous one was inaccessible to the sense of sorrow on account of himself. Even while he saw his limbs being cut off, his forbearance remained unshaken, but that he saw the king fallen from righteousness made him sore with grief. So again, he doesn't really care about his own body, and he'll come back to this in a second, but he is worried on behalf of the king. So verily, the compassionate who are great in retaining their tranquility throughout are not so much afflicted by pain arising in themselves as they grieve on account of the suffering of others. But the king, after performing that cruel deed, was anon caught by a fire-like fever, and when he went out of the gardens, earth on a sudden opened and swallowed him. So he steps out to leave, and the earth just opens up and swallows him. So sort of instant karmic recompense. And then at this point, it's kind of funny. The king's courtiers are all like really worried because they think that Kshantivadan, being this great practitioner, has these great sort of supernatural karmic powers, basically. And because their sort of group of people has wronged him, that he's gonna like curse the entire like city and bring it all down. So they sort of plead with him, like, please don't kill all of us, And of course, being the future Buddha, he has no intention of doing that. So he says, a being subject to sorrow, death, and sickness, subdued by desire and hatred, consumed by his evil actions, is a person to be pitied. Who ought to get angry with such a one? So he says, and of course, these are the marks of existence, right? Sorrow, death, sickness, subdued by desire and hatred, the two of the three poisons. So we're all kind of in this same boat, and those afflicted by these things should be pitied, we shouldn't get angry at them, because it's something common to all humans. For many kalpas, that is eons, I have lost my worthless body in manifold ways, in numbers of existences. How is it that I should give up forbearance on account of the destruction of that frame? Would it not be as if I were to give up a jewel of the first water for a straw? So I like this idea too. So it's like sort of trading water for a straw, right? The body is in this case sort of just a vessel by which we can kind of live a wholesome life, right? And if we're willing to give that up and get furiously angry or hold a grudge or get revenge by rampaging through a whole city afterwards, then what good is this physical body? It's like trading a straw for water. So you can't drink the water, obviously, if you've just got the straw. So he continues, dwelling in the forest, bound to my vow of world renunciation, a preacher of forbearance and soon a prey to death, how should I feel the desire of revenge? Do not fear me any longer then. Peace be to you, go. After thus instructing and at the same time admitting them as disciples in the lore of the pious, that foremost of munis who kept his constancy unshaken owing to his reliance on forbearance, left his earthly residence and mounted to heaven. Of course, happy ending. So that's the end of the story. It has these little like footnotes here again. And it says, so then indeed to those who have wholly imbibed the virtue of forbearance and are great in keeping their tranquility, there is nothing unbearable. This was the same thing that it said at the beginning. And then it also says, thus is to be said when discoursing on the virtue of forbearance, taking the Muni for example. So that's what I did. On account of the vices of rashness and wrath, taking the king for example, this story is also to be told. So you can also use it if you want to say that you shouldn't be rash like the king. And when expounding the miserable consequences of sensual pleasures, saying, in this manner sensual pleasures lead a man to become addicted to wicked behavior, which brings him into ruin, it may also be told. So there's a number of possible occasions that the story tells us that we can use it. Okay, so that was a little bit long, but I like these old stories, and it's one that I hadn't heard before, so I thought I'd share it with you all. So of course these stories tend to be pretty extreme, right? Like I don't think anyone in this room would be comfortable having their limbs cut off and would be able to just sit there calmly and be like, oh, this is fine. And I think that's not really the point, probably. I think stories of the Buddha or the Buddha's past lives are all just kind of extreme examples of perfection, something that we can aspire to, not something that we realistically need to be able to achieve. So, in what small way might we express this kind of patience? In what small way might we kind of have this same mind, even if we obviously wouldn't be able to withstand being cut limb from limb? So, as I mentioned before, this Sanskrit word has a variety of synonyms. It was kind of interesting thinking about these different words. So endurance and patience, forbearance, tolerance. And they kind of all boil down to the same idea. They have slightly different nuance, I guess. So like endurance, I think of maybe being a little bit more physical rather than mental, although not always, and maybe involving something that's more strongly negative. Patience, maybe is a little more minor. If we're being patient versus enduring something, it's maybe not quite as bad. Forbearance seems to have more to do with restraining from doing something. And then tolerance sort of has a little bit of a vibe of kind of deep down disapproving of whatever the thing is, but like sort of bearing through it anyways. The Digital Dictionary of Buddhism, which is a good online resource if you've never encountered it before, says that Kshanti has the nuance of being steady in one's practice in the face of difficulty and temptation, especially bearing insult and distress without resentment. So, basically putting up with things that we don't like without, getting angry or upset about it. And one of the things that I think is interesting about patience, and a reason I think why it's one of the paramitas or perfections, is because it has this really close relationship with impermanence, which is one of the fundamental features or hallmarks of the Buddhist understanding of the world, and also the three poisons, so greed, anger, and ignorance, the three things that we try to avoid as Buddhists. So, what is it that leads us to impatience? I think that it's sort of like we're treating, in part, whatever's happening to us as sort of like a permanent thing that we want to escape from. We don't really acknowledge that we can just put up with it for a little while and it'll probably come to an end. I think that that's part of it. If we have a deep understanding of impermanence, I think we're better able to be patient because we sort of understand that this isn't going to last probably all that long, and we can just sort of put up with it. So that's one kind of way of looking at it. But another is, its relationship to the three poisons, like I said. So, of course, we're impatient because we desire a different set of circumstances, right? So that's greed, right? We're greedy for something that doesn't make us impatient, basically. And of course, impatience is when we have an aversion to whatever the situation is. So whatever's going on, we're trying to push it away, saying, I don't want that. I want this over there. And then, of course, both of these things are an expression of ignorance, of not really understanding the nature of suffering. Because, of course, in this case, if we really understood the nature of impatience, the nature of suffering, we would know that, it's related to this clinging. We're clinging for something else. So it's also an expression of ignorance. And I also just think it's interesting how frequently any kind of negativity can really be boiled down to these three poisons. Really, I think any negative emotion or negative aspect of life, if you analyze it, it will sort of always break down into greed, anger, or ignorance, or all three. Okay, so the typical Sino-Japanese translation of the word for patience is ninniku, which literally means something like enduring humiliation. And in Dogen's writings, he often wrote in Japanese. So in this case, he usually used the words shinobu or taeru, which are the sort of Japanese equivalents for that, so enduring or bearing. So in Shobogenzo Zuimonki, which is a text we read every morning, he's often talking about enduring poverty to his monks. he says that we should just endure poverty because that's the way that bodhisattvas should live. Also cold weather or lack of food and so on. He uses this word to have patience with these things. So coming back to what I said at the beginning, as I was researching this word shinobu seemed kind of familiar to me. And I was like, where do I know that word from? And then, I remembered. So as we have talked about several times, for the baby boomers in the room, the TV show Kung Fu was like the only East Asian cultural reference around for the most part. But in my generation, we had lots, and I'd say especially because, video games were a big thing and most of them were made in Japan. So that's where I knew this word shinobu from, because there was a video game for Sega Genesis called Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master. And so, I was like, so shinobi is just a different word for ninja. It is like one who does the thing of shinobu. So shinobu is supposed to mean to endure, but it also has this meaning of to hide, which is kind of interesting. And then nin is the same. It can be used either to mean kind of to hide or to endure. So that's why, of course, you should all be ninjas, because a ninja, it means sort of one who hides oneself, one who conceals oneself. But if you read that character nin as meaning to endure, it's one who has patience or one who endures, one who has forbearance. It's never been used that way, but it could be. Okay, so going further with this idea of hiding or of concealing oneself, I think we can maybe understand how these two words became related. So the Chinese character only has the meaning of patience or enduring. It doesn't have the hide part. So it seems that somehow the same character was used for the Japanese idea, or it developed into that. But at any rate, there is kind of a relationship, I think, because when we are patient, in a way, we're kind of hiding our emotions, right? That's one way to think about it. I think as a Buddhist ideal, we'd probably be going beyond that, but at least that's one way to think about patience, as sort of we're not letting our kind of immediate emotional reaction take over. We're sort of hiding them. But I think another more interesting, more sort of Dogen-esque way to think about this, and I should say for those maybe joining us for the first time, Dogen is the founder of this particular sect of Buddhism. He lived in the 13th century, and he was a prolific writer, and he wrote in a very sort of unique style where he really plays with language a lot. And he used this idea of hiding within things in sort of a strange way. And I think that ultimately these maybe come back to an earlier Chinese koan story that goes as follows. So someone asked the Chan or Zen master Yunmen Wenyan, how can the Dharma body be explained in words? And then Yunmen, the master, replied, hiding in the Big Dipper. So this is sort of a famous koan. But what does that mean? That's a little, how do you hide in the Big Dipper? It seems kind of far away. I think, one way that we can understand this is the way that we understand the world as Zen Buddhists is that there's no separation between self and other, right? So in our typical run-of-the-mill worldview, I'm over here, you all are out there, we're totally cut off and separate from one another. But another way of looking at the world is that we're all fundamentally connected, right? The food that I eat comes from someone else's labor. It is like literally atoms and stuff that are out there in the world that come into my body and become a part of it. The air that I'm breathing to stay alive moment by moment is passing in between us. So there's this constant impermanent exchange, right, going on. And then, of course, I as a person am constantly changing, just as all of you are, and one day I'm going to die and my sort of atoms will be recycled into other things, and hopefully in some small way I will have been able to influence people for the good, and that will kind of trickle down into future generations, maybe. So in this way, we're fundamentally connected, right? It doesn't negate the fact that we're also sort of separate. Both of these things exist simultaneously. So in this sense, hiding in the Big Dipper, we're already fundamentally connected to everything in the universe, including the Big Dipper. And I think that this word hide here means to kind of like actualize that non-separation, to really behave in the world in such a way that expresses this non-separation. And that's kind of what the Dharma body is. So in this question, how can the Dharma body be explained in words? So the Dharma body is an expression of reality as it is, which in turn expresses this non-separation and separation coexisting at the same time. So Dogen also uses this idea of hiding in various things. He has a fascicle of the Shobogenzo on the Udumbara flower where he uses this metaphor. I looked at it, but it involves so much kind of like backstory explanation that I didn't want to dwell on it today. But if you are interested in it, you can look there for him talking about flowers hiding in eyes and the eyes hiding in thorns and this sort of thing. But like I said, you have to like understand all the poems and stuff that he's talking about. But a simpler sort of instance where he uses it, and it's actually one of my favorite poems that Dogen wrote, is a poem called Prostrations, or Raihai. And this is Okumura Roshi's translation. So this is how this one goes. Grasses lie unseen in the field under snow. The white egret hides itself in its own appearance. So I'll read it one more time. Grasses lie unseen in the field under snow. The white egret hides itself in its own appearance. And this was translated in the version of Shobogenzo Zuimonki that Okumura Roshi published, which we read in the morning. There's a section of Dogen's poems in the back as well. And so I'm just going to read his commentary on this poem since he says it well. So this is the scenery of a midwinter's day. All kinds of grasses, short and tall, are buried under deep snow. So this idea of grasses is often used to express sort of the multitude of things in the world. The scene is very different from snow on the bright leaves of autumn. The entire world is covered in snow, and it is still snowing continuously. The bird is also white, so we cannot distinguish it from its environment. It seems the bird is hiding within its own color. So this is this idea of non-separation, right? Everything is just being blanketed in snow, and the bird and everything in the universe all just becomes this one kind of sheet of white. The making of prostrations is the same. We are part of the network of interdependent origination, and by offering prostrations, we hide ourselves within the world of interdependent origination. We disappear into this world and become one with all beings. So as I was doing my prostrations this morning, I was kind of thinking about this. And when I first came to Zen practice, I had sort of been, I don't know, kind of interested in atheism and like all religions are bad. So when I was kind of asked to do prostrations, I was pretty uncomfortable with it. But I'd say not long after, I think, I started picking up on this kind of vibe of what's going on when we do a prostration. It's really, in a sense, it's just symbolic, right? Like we're kind of lowering ourselves to the Buddha, but it is also a physical act. So you can, I think, really kind of feel it in lowering yourself in this way, that you're just sort of sinking into this world of interdependent origination. So I like that that's the title of this poem, even though he's talking about an egret in the snow. The title is Prostrations. And then Okumura Roshi continues here. In the record of the Hokyo era, Dogen recorded one of his dialogues with his teacher, Tiantong Rujing. When Dogen made a prostration, Rujing said, As for their nature, the person who makes a prostration and the person who receives it are empty and serene. The correspondence and interpenetration of the way between them is beyond comprehension. Not only the giver and receiver of a prostration, but all beings in the entire Dharma world are hidden within this prostration. Everything disappears into the deep white snow of the Dharma. So I think that's, the attitude that maybe we should aspire to when we do our prostrations. Think about how we really are one with all reality. I think it's interesting to note, so I've been talking about hiding, but coming back to patience, that herons and egrets are very patient birds. I don't know if you've ever observed a heron or an egret as they look for fish, but they will often stand completely still for long periods of time, just sort of waiting for the right moment. So they're very patient, and while they're doing this, they do really seem to almost disappear, and you can walk right past one and not notice it. I was in Washington, D.C. To get a visa for an upcoming trip to Japan, and that's where my family's from too. And in D.C. there's it's called the C&O Canal, so it was an old canal that was built before the time of railroads to transport goods. So it goes from D.C. over into like Western Maryland. And it's still, it's owned by the National Park Service now. And it's got basically what they used to do is they had these boats in the canal, and then they would have like donkeys with ropes attached to them pull the boats down the canal. So there was a towpath where the donkeys would go, and now that's a popular hiking trail in the DC area. And they don't really maintain the water level very high, but it still has water in it. So it's just kind of a big kind of horizontal marsh now, essentially. And it's got a lot of herons in it, and they're accustomed to people because a lot of people use it. So I was walking on it a few times, and there were a number of occasions where, I'd walked right past a heron, and I had sort of noticed it at the last minute, just, standing there, being very patient. So I think it's interesting that this relationship between this hiding and patience. You could even say that they're ninja-like. And I think, Dogen, when he writes, he will often say at the end of paragraphs or thoughts that we should investigate this. And I'd say we should investigate this connection between hiding and patience. Okay, so let's see. Another instance where we find patience mentioned in Dogen's writing is when he talks about the okesa, so this outer garment that we as priests wear. So the okesa has many epithets, so sort of little phrases attached to it, and some of these we say in the morning when we put on the robe. So in the text, he describes a bunch of these epithets. So he says, the okesa is the clothing of liberation, which is geida puku. This is one of the things we say in the morning. The robe without form, which is musoe, another one we say. The supreme robe, and the robe of endurance, ninnikue, so the robe of endurance, the robe of patience. The robe of the Tathagata, the robe of great benevolence and great compassion, etc. So I think it's interesting that that's one of the epithets, right? When we put on this robe, we're clothing ourselves in patience, or at least we should try to have that attitude, I think. So it's a chance for us to remember that intention. When we put this on, when we put on our rakusus, we can remember what we aspire to. And not to mention, for those of us who have had to sew these things by hand, there's a lot of patience involved. It takes a long time. I think, this one, I had a fair bit of help with it, but I think it, took me over a year to sew it, and that, involved many weeks of not doing anything. But, whenever I would come back to it, I'd get a little bit done and then put it away for a while. And of course, Myogen, I think, can attest to this. We worked together for a long time on his stuff and our stuff. Just kind of briefly, why I chose to speak on this topic. So as I mentioned, I'm getting ready to go to Japan in early October, and I will enter a monastery for 3 to 6 months starting November 1st. And I tried this once before, and I spent like a week there, and I was like, I don't like this, and I left. And so I wasn't very patient. I didn't really give it a chance. I got there and kind of just quickly made up my mind and left. And when we do new things, that's an especially important time, I think, to let patience help you out. I think that when we're changing our routine, that's the easiest time to get impatient with whatever it is that you're trying to do or whatever the new situation entails. Like when we start a new job or when we have a new roommate or something, all of these things can sort of test our patience. So I wanted to talk about this because I know that I need to work on my patience. I'm not a very patient person. Probably many of you who have practiced with me over the years have seen me in impatient moments. So here's to hoping that I can sort of build my patience, become more ninja-like perhaps, and that for those of you who need to work on it, that you can all do the same. And so with that, I will end for today. So thank you very much. Any kind of questions or comments about anything?
So we start from this round. If anybody has questions to Doju about this topic, please speak.
I don't think I really have a question, more of a comment.
Mm-hmm.
From the story, it sounds like you want to give up, you're trying to give up anger in order to be patient.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I've found in my practice is that's really not the case.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example from yesterday. I was in Terre Haute, and I need GPS to get out of there. And it gave me a back road instead of taking me on I-70. I did not want to be on the back road, I wanted to be on I-70. I got very irritated with this and my body was angry.
Mm-hmm.
And since I am freshly mented, I go, why am I angry at this? This is kind of strange. It's not that I'm getting lost, I just wanted to drive really, really fast, right? And so I just said, okay, just pay attention to what you have now. My anger is still there. I'm getting through it. It's slowly diminishing, and I'm starting to enjoy the scenery. It's kind of a bizarre thing to see a totally abandoned house with trees up all around it. It looks like a big bush with a couple pieces of wood sticking out. But it's like, oh, that's actually kind of pretty. And I got to see and notice that with a little bit of anger inside, but it's still going through. So, and I see this with all things with my practice. I'll get annoyed at something, I'll realize what I'm doing, where I am, go, oh, okay. And then I'll become more patient with what's going on, and I'll also see that anger, it's still there, but still diminishing, going away. So in my sense, I'm not really hiding anything. I'm just processing all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the patience is the present moment, just giving time to see what you have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Instead of what you're thinking you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say to use Dogen's terminology. So I mentioned that, in one sense, being patient is like hiding your emotions. But I also said that, it's kind of like a shallow form of patience, maybe. But I think what, the way that Dogen would say it, and maybe could describe what you yourself were describing, was kind of that you hid yourself in the situation, in reality, So in that sense, you kind of opened yourself up to what is going on outside of you, not just inside of you. And in that way, you're sort of hiding yourself in the situation. it's an abstract way of using the word, but that's like often the way that Dogen kind of uses it, and the way that this, I think, the koan intends it. It's not like, you know, the sense of hiding your emotions, right? So yeah, I think that that's consistent with what you described, you know. And it's not that anger won't be there, you know, unless we become perfected like Kashanti Vaden, which we probably shouldn't count on. You know, the anger will be there. So it's sort of like what you described. We need to open ourselves up to not just the sort of small desires of this little skin bag, as we say in our tradition, but rather just sort of seeing reality for what it is, even if both of those things are happening at the same time. Thank you for that.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I'm someone who struggles a lot with patience because I have ADHD, and I've noticed the more I practice and the more I sit Zazen, my patience vastly improves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I didn't really talk much at all about Zazen in the talk today, but, you know, when I was doing the research for this talk, there's a popular podcast that some of you might know called the Zen Studies Podcast. The woman who does it is Domio Burke, I think her name is. And I read she had she also gives like the transcriptions, I think, of the talk, so I was looking at that. And she talks about Zazen as sort of, you know, one way that we could think about it as kind of a builder of patience, right? Because Zazen really requires a lot of patience. We're just sitting quietly, standing at the wall, and whatever comes up, you know, we have to deal with it. We can't really escape from it. And it's so interesting, I think, that, you know, having practiced that Sanshinji for a while, you know, sometimes people will start in this practice and they're very fidgety, for example, like they move around a lot. And it just seems like they're sort of trying anything to kind of escape from having to sit there and just sort of deal with the situation. But very often that goes away over time, you know, and the same people that you notice who are doing that are perfectly still a few years later. And so I think that you're absolutely right. Of course, you know, we always have to give the caveat that, you know, when we practice Zazen, our intention should not be to gain anything from it. So, you know, we shouldn't really take up a practice of Zazen, you know, solely with the intention of maybe being more patient. But certainly as we do it, and especially if we can do it with that attitude, I think that that is one of the kind of effects that it has. Certainly, I think that Todo-san is one of the most patient people I've met. He has lots of crazy students like me that he is very patient with. He's been doing a lot of Zazen, so there might be a correlation there. So yeah, thank you for raising that. I think that's true.
And so I struggle with patience a lot for the same reason, and I do find that there's something that's like most context dependent, just because it's like when I'm in this practice and I can do, it's like I can see myself in this particular place, and all of a sudden I feel a lot more patience. But almost the moment that I can get out into a different solstice setting, then my mindset completely changes, and that just kind of eager, impatient aspect almost comes back. There are times that I feel like I could really sort of bring myself to some level of I guess peace or equanimity, but there again, so I remember when I was spent a time abroad over in the spring, I had a lot of time to get some medications together, and at first, you know, there was a lot of things that I had to go through, booking a lot of patients, and then booking a lot of appointments, and then I was talking to a lot of people in the insurance company, and I was, you know, and I had them thanking me so much for my patience and taking so long, and then as it got to like a week beforehand, I still couldn't get the medications that I want. Like the conversations that I had, I was increasingly impatient, and so the same people that might have been talking to me like 2 months earlier probably saw a very kind, patient person, and the people that would see me at that particular time probably heard like an eager mess and somebody that was just like wanting to say or anything and screaming inside just so that I could get like those medications together so they could leave it a week. And so there was like a huge difference, I would say, like in terms, but I also saw a huge difference in terms of the impact between maybe not having those medications for 3 months versus like, oh, I'm going to have them, but I've got some time to get them figured out. And so in some sense, I do find that maintaining that level of patience to be very difficult when the stakes increase significantly.
Yeah, and I think that it's always, I think, worth bringing this back up, sort of like you did, Myogen, that, you know, we have all the sort of nice stories that we read about people that are perfected, you know, and they never express any impatience at all. But of course, the reality is often not quite so glorious as that. And for me, you know, I always like to think of this practice as an intersection between self-acceptance and self-improvement. You know, we're not trying to do just one or the other. You know, it's not solely just like, it's very similar to, you know, Suzuki Roshi's saying, you're fine just the way you are, but you could use a little improvement, which I've always liked. So, you know, it's not completely that we're just like, everything's fine, I don't need to do anything, but it's also not like, you know, I need to be perfect. You know, so we need to find, I think, some kind of middle ground there. And so, who knows what you would have been like without any practice, maybe you would have been impatient from the start. And, you know, as you described, you noticed it, you know, you're self-aware about it, a lot of people wouldn't be. So, you know, I think that these instances, you know, of noticing are instances that we can, you know, work on that self-improvement part maybe, but also accept that we're not perfect, you know, and that it's okay for us to go astray. So, you know, as we say, we you know, must always vow and repent, you know, so we're always trying to improve and then accepting that we're not always going to succeed, so.
Actually, I was surprised. I thought you were very patient when I broke your tail lamp of your car. I was like, what?
He was really hiding it.
I was right alongside Lake Geneva at the time, next to the ninja like swans. A pretty secret thing, but
I do remember, it's been a long time ago, we were having an interaction, and your body language was that of annoyance.
Doesn't surprise me.
And my emotional reaction was the desire to strangle you. And then I felt really bad about that for several weeks. I wanted to strangle this fellow. But no problem, I forgive you. I hope you can forgive me too.
Yes.
And I do pray for your patience and mine.
Thank you. I don't have that effect on people. Just ask out.
But you know, in the tantric tradition, when you have that negativity, the teachings are to drop the narrative and then sit with the energy and then see where it goes. It reminded me of in my precept class, which I took with Mizumi, somebody said, well, how do you not get angry? And his answer was, well, by not getting angry. And, excuse me, how's that helpful exactly? A little bit of tautology, or can you give me something a little more practical? Well, he actually did. He simply said, it's not that you're not going to feel those things, but there's a difference between experiencing them in the sense of I am angry, or the awareness that there is anger.
Yeah.
And when you can drop the narrative and just be with the energy, then that's the way you don't get angry, by not identifying, not that the energy's not there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's sort of what we do in our Zazen, right? Is you can kind of separate, you know, me as the subject of whatever's going on, and just sort of having all of those things arise and pass away as you sit there. So we take that backward step, you know, as Dogen says. It can be difficult, of course, off the cushion, even on the cushion. But yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. Taking a moment to just create that little separation between ourselves and the emotion is, I think, really helpful and important. So thank you. Yeah.
Thursday evenings, I got to bring it up because the kind of Buddhism we practice on Thursday evening, Recovery Dharma group, everybody's so fresh and just interested in this, and impatience comes up an awful lot. And I realize with your talk today that a lot of it happens around the Eightfold Path and just grabbing what each part of that is. It occurred to me that one of the things we do at the beginning of each meeting is read out the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. And they refer to everything in the Eightfold Path as wise understanding, wise thought, etc., etc. And I've always hated that for some reason. Because if anything that's going on there, nobody is wise in there. It feels wise, So I've been trying to encourage thinking about the perfect parts of the Eightfold Path, because when you think of the perfect parts, like perfect effort is effortlessness, and perfect speech is, the kind of being patient and being not reacting but responding. And finally, that's starting to click, but it's a new thing every single week that we kind of go off on. So just to put that out there.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly something that we're all constantly confronted with. I mean, I think it's probably rare not to have a day when you don't feel impatient at some point. Certainly for me, like driving is a big thing. As again, Ellie can attest to, I'm almost always impatient when I'm in the car. Again, I grew up, in the DC area where there's a lot of traffic, so I went crazy at a young age. But again, I think it's this constant opportunity for practice. And as Dogen said in Mahayana Buddhism, that all of the senses are dharma gates, right? So even though it's our interaction with the world that causes us suffering in one sense when we attach to one thing or the other, they're also equally opportunities for us to practice. So I think again, being able to take that step back, realizing what's going on, having that self-awareness to maybe say to yourself, this is an instance where I don't have to have this reaction. I can change. I can do something differently. So
there's a little more in there too. Perfection takes time.
Yeah.
Perfection takes practice, but also you think of perfect effortlessness or whatever. It's also a kind of boundlessness, and I can appreciate them for that.
The classical story, I think it's told in several traditions. The holy man up in the mountain in the cave meditating for many, many, many years until he thinks he's perfected. And then he goes into the marketplace and somebody backs up against him. What are you doing? It's like it's easy enough to seem perfect when you're not doing anything. But as soon as you start interacting with circumstances in a karmic world, then you get stimulated and the seeds of all that come out. So that your interactions with the world become part of your dharma.
Yeah, I think that there's a perception sometimes that people have about Buddhists is that, we're just kind of sitting navel gazing all the time and we can escape from all of these difficulties in the world. But I think the opposite is actually true, having to, as you were describing about strangling me, having to exist as a community has challenges, It's kind of relatively easier to just stay at home and not interact with anyone. but I think that that's why Sangha is so important in our practice. So yeah, if you're going off and just sitting by yourself constantly, that sort of ignores the Sangha aspect in a lot of ways. And it's through practice with Sangha, through, you know, people that might not necessarily be your kind of, the people that you would choose as like your most intimate friends, you know, learning to treat them all with compassion and respect and patience, you know, I think is one of the values of Sangha. So, yeah.
Anybody else in the room? We will go to Zoom land.
Anyone online have any thoughts or comments, questions?
Maybe they have more patience.
All right, well, maybe we can leave it there. Thank you for patiently enduring my talk. And,